Have you ever found yourself scratching your head, wondering how to reconcile seemingly contradictory ideas? More to the point, have you ever been stumped by ideas in the Christian faith that seem totally at odds with one another? If so, you are not alone. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Monday, August 15th, 2022. This week we'll be looking at some of the concepts in Christian faith that seem to be opposed to one another. Some of these apparent contradictions come in the form of dilemmas, others in the form of paradoxes, and still others in the form of polarities. Over the last few weeks, we've looked at the law in the Old Testament, first the Ten Commandments, then the two laws Jesus singles out as being the greatest, and finally, sets of laws that I suggested have continuing significance for us in the Christian church, even if the literal directive no longer applies to us. Think of laws related to sacrifice, for example. But underlying this entire discussion of the law was the question, are we bound to the law or are we free from the law? My answer was that we are both bound and yet free from the law. How this is so is one of the paradoxes of Christian faith, a paradox for which there is an answer. Another way to pose this question that's helpful, I think, is to look at it as a paradox between law on the one hand and gospel on the other, or law and grace. Nearly every Sunday in our church, we recite together a summary of the law. The point in the service when we recite it is important and holds a clue to the answer to this paradox. We say it after the prayer of confession and assurance of pardon. This may seem like an inconsequential thing, but it's really not. In the history of Christianity, there have been two typical answers to the question of what use is the law in the Old Testament. Martin Luther suggested two uses or purposes of the law. The first use of the law is that law shows us how far we fall short of being righteous before God. It reminds us that as much as we think of ourselves as good people, we still fail and fall short. So the first use of the law is to convict us of our sin. The second use of the law is more practical. It restrains evil. When we read the law, to the extent that we pay attention to it and value it, it keeps us from sinning any more than we already do. So in churches where these understandings of the law hold sway, the law, if it is read at all in worship, is read before the prayer of confession. Why? Because it reminds us of our need to confess our sin. But to these uses of the law, our old friend John Calvin added a third use, the law as our teacher. It still functions to show us our sin and to restrain evil, but it also has the positive function of guiding us, teaching us, showing us the ways of righteousness. So in Reformed churches like ours that actually read a summary of the law, we say it after the prayer of confession and assurance of pardon, precisely because of this teaching function. Pay attention to the words the liturgist says in introducing the summary of the law, and you'll hear this echoed. As forgiven people, we are not left without guidance for living. Indeed, God has given us the law as our teacher. The apparent paradox of being both bound to the law and yet free from its often tedious requirements is resolved in understanding it not as a set of rigid rules which, if we follow them to the T, we are righteous, and if we fail, we are condemned. So with the Apostle Paul, we know that the law cannot make us righteous before God. But that doesn't render the law null and void. It still functions to guide us. In a very real sense, then, the relationship between law and gospel, between law and grace, is not so much a dilemma as a paradox. And the paradox finds its resolution in the way we treat the law not as rigid rules, but as gracious guidance. Tomorrow, the age-old question of predestination versus free will. But for now, May God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.